It's all about acknowledging the history, living the history through it, and remembering that as the stories start to fade, we should keep them alive forever. And that's why it's on us, not just Jewish people, but as humanity as a whole, to remember these stories so they're not repeated, not against Jews and not against other groups.
This is In Good Faith, where it's our privilege to hear stories and accounts from believers, told in their own words. Our hope is to listen with an open heart, celebrating the power of faith and belief, and what those stories mean to the ones who tell them. Today on In Good Faith, we've got an episode that deals with nationality, that deals with faith, that deals with immigration, that deals with the Holocaust. I'm so excited about our guests. And in studio today, I've got senior producer Heather Bigley.
Hello.
And producer Tanya Lockett.
Hi.
Our first half today are two podcast hosts, which you know they're going to be good talkers already before it even starts. And these are Mariam Wahba. She's an Egyptian Coptic Christian. She'll explain that in just a moment. She's a writer on the Middle East and serves as the Associate Director of Advocacy for the Philos Project, an organization devoted to fostering positive Christian engagement in the Near East. And her co-host is Adela Cojab, a Syrian Lebanese Mexican Jew. And she speaks at conferences and college campuses about anti-Semitism, Zionism, and human rights. Together, they have this fabulous podcast called Americanish.
And I love this podcast. I love the idea of the podcast. Let's have as many American stories as we can get into the public sphere, and let's hear where everybody's from and what they bring to the American story. Here are two people who are being very generous with us and with their listeners about what they love about America, what challenges them about America.
I like their idea of the religious communities in America, and there's several religious communities, but they're still all America.
And there's this journey that sometimes teenagers feel like they have to make of differentiation, which is, I'm not going to be just like my parents. Sometimes that goes into religion. And both of these guests are going to talk about that journey for them and where it ended up, which I think is beautiful.
All right, well, let's get started with Adela and Mariam.
So the Coptic Christians are the indigenous Christians of Egypt. They have been there since the beginning of time. It was actually St. Mark the Evangelist who traveled to Alexandria somewhere between 40 and 60 AD, so very close to the death of Jesus Christ, and started to evangelize. And because the ancient Egyptians had these ideas of a forgiving God, an afterlife, and a few more coincidentally similar things with Christianity, a lot of the ancient Egyptians began to convert to Christianity. And at one point, Egypt was an 85% Christian nation, which always surprises people. Then the Arab invasion happened and Egypt became a Muslim majority country. But to put it in a nutshell, to use your terms, Copts are the indigenous Christians of Egypt. The word Coptic, in fact, is a Greek word meaning Egypt. Or Egyptian. It's what the ancient Greeks used to call the ancient Egyptians. They've been there for centuries. My community has survived generations of massacres and persecutions, and it's really a story of survival. The Coptic community today is still surviving at around 10 million Copts still living in Egypt, making up around 10% of the Egyptian population. It's still rough out there for Copts, which is why there's a growing diaspora all over the world, me being part of that diaspora.
In listening to your podcast, even though I thought I knew a little bit, and I did a little, but just within 30 seconds, I was getting all new stuff. I did not know that it's part of the Orthodox tradition from Eastern Christianity.
That's right. It's actually part of the Oriental family. So it's still Eastern, but Oriental. So us and the Armenians and three more churches are in one family. And then there's the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, etc.
And there's several thousand years of history just in those few sentences. Lots of history back and forth. I'm wondering, Adela, we were just past Holocaust Remembrance Day, just a few days. And it's so interesting to me as we get further and further from some of those most recent events, how easy it is for people to mischaracterize or forget about them. Does that surprise you?
I mean, it's sad, but not surprising. And I remember when I first stepped to a camp The first time in my life I went to Terezín, which is in the Czech Republic. And there's a very different feeling seeing it when you're there in person, and you just feel a certain weight. And I was very lucky that I got to grow up hearing from Holocaust survivors directly and learning from them directly about the horrors of the Holocaust. Thank God no one in my family was affected. We were in the Middle East, so we didn't get any of that, thank God. But it's not surprising. I think that if we don't keep history alive, it will be forgotten. And that's why it's on us, not just Jewish people, but as humanity as a whole, to remember these stories so they're not repeated, not against Jews and not against other groups.
Well, amen.
Amen.
I can't argue with that. The two of you are doing something so interesting, which is being very true to your own culture while still being very hospitably engaged with each other.
I think we're both very dangerously curious people. Curiosity killed the cat, and we've definitely gotten ourselves into some icky situations personally and professionally. At least I can say I have, because of how curious we are. But I think it's also what makes this project, Americanish, so interesting.
How did you find each other and decide we should both be in a room talking about our various religious and cultural traditions?
It's actually a very cute story. It's meet cute, if you're familiar with the term. I just learned what that meant earlier this year. A mutual friend of ours, we were having two random conversations with her, and we were both talking about the Ottoman Empire out of all things to talk about, casual, light conversation. And she called me up and she told me, I met your soulmate, the person I was just talking to. I was also talking about the Ottoman Empire with her, and she was saying the exact same thing. And she did the same to Adela, and she's like, we need to get lunch together. Let's just talk. If nothing else, you two should meet. The first few episodes we did, our producer at the time told us to not talk outside of cameras. So to not discuss anything until the cameras were rolling. And it led to some really interesting moments. There was this moment in episode 2 where I was telling Adela about the Coptic tattoo, which I'm happy to explain. But the gist of it is that we tattoo our children when we're young to be able to identify themselves. And it originates in that we were forced to tattoo our children because you had to identify yourself as a dhimmi, or a second-class citizen in the past. So it just became a tradition where we turned something that was forced upon us to something that we embrace. And I just casually dropped something to Adele, I got my tattoo when I was 8 months old, and it's this cross. And she had to take a minute and stop, because she just could not wrap her head around tattooing babies, which does sound bizarre, I have to admit. But it makes really good, interesting content.
One of the things that Mariam and I always love to say is, not only do we get to learn about each other, but we get to learn about each other on screen. Because actually, before we filmed our first episode, we had only met 3 times, twice in person and once on Zoom. So really, when we're saying we're learning about each other, it really was learning about each other. And we get to share that with our own community. So I get to share Mariam with my community. Mariam gets to share me with her community. And the learning on screen about each other was definitely a process. The way we used to plan our episodes was we would pick a topic and we would say, do you have something to say about this? And she'd be like, yep, you. And I'd be like, yep. And we'd have no idea what the other was going to say. So we could have come in guns blaring and clashed. But, even though we disagreed, we've always been able to find common ground, respect. And we haven't had any of those crazy moments where we say, that this isn't working. No, it's really been a great learning opportunity to learn about other perspectives.
I wonder if I could ask each of you, because you talk early on about maybe a time in your life where you thought you would distance yourself a little bit from the tradition. And in time, you each have reaffirmed that aspect of yourself. It's
really interesting, the journey of immigrants particularly, because you live in 2 worlds at the same time. You're trying to, or your parents are at least trying to make sure that you don't lose the language, you don't lose the faith, you don't lose the culture, but you're a young child and you want to assimilate because you want to dress the same way to the kids in school. You want to be able to talk without an accent. You want to just fit in, whatever that means, whatever you identify that to mean. So it does lend itself to a period in your life, and I think this is normal and healthy. We just don't talk about it. So people don't, or our kids don't know that it's normal and healthy, where you're rejecting everything. You're rejecting your native tongue. You're rejecting your faith. You're rejecting your culture because it makes you unique and different. And as you grow older, you start to realize those are the things that make us who we are and make us special and make us lovable. And coming back to who you are, relearning who you are, and then learning to appreciate it and to add on it is really a beautiful journey. And it pains me when people don't find their way back, because it usually means something traumatic happened to where they're actively resisting finding their way back to who they are. But I'm really thankful I did, because I don't know who I would be, whether it's personally, professionally, without this part of my identity, being Egyptian, being Coptic, being Arab.
I had the honor and the privilege of growing up in a community of faith. So my family was in Mexico in a Syrian Jewish community, which is a very specific Jewish community. And then I moved to New Jersey and grew up in the same exact specific Jewish community, the Syrian Jewish community of New Jersey. So my traditions, my traditional foods, customs, religion, everything was the same. And growing up in high school, I always clashed heads. And it wasn't until I got to college, and that was when I was in my rejection phase, where I said, this is so limiting, or it's this, or it's such a one-way view of seeing. After about my first couple of months in college, I realized that faith is a superpower. And I think that one of the reasons why a lot of kids rebel is because they want answers and they want logic and they want all these specific things laid out perfectly. And it really takes stepping outside of the community of faith to realize that you might not necessarily have all the answers. But to me, that's what faith is. It gives you the lack, the hole that you'll never fill with words. And I really appreciated it. And we both have younger sisters, and we talk about how our sisters are going to go through that phase. But ultimately, what you have to remember again is coming back home. It's a sense of homecoming. I don't know about you guys, but when I enter a synagogue, it doesn't matter where I am in the world. It doesn't matter if it's exactly my kind of synagogue or a different kind. I feel a sense of homecoming, and I feel comfort, and I feel suddenly like I'm not just wandering. So yes, we had our little rebellious phases, if we want to call them that. But ultimately, I'm really glad that this does define me, and it's something that will always define me.
What is it that makes you trust in or believe in a God or a higher power, or the way what you would describe that as? Is that possible to comment on?
I think it's more of a feeling. So for me, the thing that was lacking, that thing that words can't fill, to me is just the idea of connection. Connection with God. A lot of people have a confidant that they talk to every day, a significant other, a parent, a best friend. But, in Judaism, we say Shema when we go to sleep. It's a blessing that you say at night, right before you go to bed. And my mom always taught me that you should pick one thing that you're grateful for when you go to sleep, and you say Shema, and you just kind of think about that thing that you're grateful for, and you hope for something for the next day. And it kind of felt like talking to a friend, because I'm recounting something I'm thankful for, and I'm looking ahead to the next day. And that's usually what we do with conversation partners. But there is something bigger. I wish I could explain what it was. I think that it must be a very lonely and sad existence to think that that's it, that this is all there is, that there has to be something else. And it doesn't matter what faith you come from, Jewish, Christian, and talking to Mariam, it's what I realized overall. As long as you believe that there's something greater than humanity and that we all have a greater purpose, that's what it is for me.
That's beautiful. And I love what your mother said about something that you were grateful for. I've heard it said that allowing gratitude is the first step to receiving love for God.
I agree.
Mariam, have you always believed in a higher power? Have you always believed in God?
I feel like ancient communities are like ours. There really isn't any other way to grow up, especially growing up in the Middle East, growing up in Egypt. I think we have this weird luxury. I don't even know if calling it a luxury is proper in the West, where we're able to shelf our faith. Like, I can be Christian on Christmas and Easter and 363 days of the year. The rest of the year, you can kind of put your faith on a shelf and forget about it. You don't need to talk about it. You don't need to outwardly express it in any way. And on a lot of parts of the world, and most parts of the world, that's really not the case. Faith and your religion is a very big part of who you are, what you do, your name even, and how you see the world. So I think I always grew up knowing that there was something more than this. Otherwise, I would be a nihilist. And I think I went through that phase as well. If I had to point to one specific thing that really strengthens my faith is our survival as Christians. There's no reason for the Copts to have survived everything that they've survived. There's no reason for the Syrians to have survived ISIS and every other trauma that they have experienced. There's no reason for the Armenians to exist in the middle of enemies facing you from every side, wanting to destroy you for hundreds of years at a time. Surviving, thriving, continuing to create and to exist is probably the most powerful sign for me that something beyond this exists. And it's, our Lord and Savior, and that he's allowing us to continue to experience life for his glory.
The organization you're part of, Philos, tell me what the organization does.
Absolutely. The Philos Project is a wonderful organization based in New York, and we promote positive Christian engagement in the Near East. That's a lot to break down, but I'll give you the abbreviated version. Our founder looked at the way that the West was interacting with the East and saw that there's a major problem in communication, in reporting, even something as simple as the news. All you see and think about when you hear the Middle East is bombs, terrorists, and that's about it. That's the end of the story. And there was a major disconnect because that part of the world is very important to the West, or at least should be, because it's without the East, we would be nothing. We would have no Hebraic traditions. We would have no ideas of democracy and existence in peace and flourishing and pluralism. So he wanted to connect East and West, and he wanted to do it in a very renewed way, renewed sense of interaction. And that's what we do. And we do it through a couple of different avenues. I specifically help lead the advocacy team. And we do a couple of different things, but primarily advocate for Eastern Christian minorities. So that includes people like the Copts and the Syrians and the Maronites, but it also includes people like Ethiopian Jews and Baha'is and Yazidis and people who most people don't know anything about, but are important to this vision of a pluralistic future where we all can live side by side.
Adela, you have a bit of activism in your history as well at NYU. Do you want to talk to me about this?
Of course. Well, when I went to NYU as an undergraduate, there was a lot of anti-Semitism. It started off as political anti-Zionism, as you'll see on a lot of college campuses, but it very easily crossed the line into blatant anti-Semitism. It got to the point that Jewish students were being boycotted. There were resolutions against the Tel Aviv campus at NYU. On our student government, professors were boycotting Israel. So it started with Israel, and then individual students started being targeted. They started posting pictures of Jewish students, calling them the fascists of the week. They burned an Israeli flag. They assaulted and battered a Jewish girl. NYPD stepped in. And throughout all of this, I'd been meeting with administrators who were telling me I was overreacting. And after the assault and the flag burning, I met with the administration again. And I said, please, you can't tell me I'm overreacting. You can't tell me I'm imagining non-existent threats.
Right.
And physical action taken against my community. What are you going to do about it? And the school decided not only not to do nothing, but they gave an award to the group that burned the flag and assaulted the girl. And after that, they refused to schedule a meeting with me for months. And I felt like my community wasn't being heard at all. So I got in touch with lawyers. And I asked if I had a case against the school. This had been going on for years, and the lawyers said no. They said that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act didn't include religion as a protected category. So they said, look, honestly, we just don't think legally you'll have a battle. I sent them everything I had anyway, and they called me back about a day later, and they said that it was the strongest case they had seen for anti-Semitism as a Title VI claim. So again, they told me legally, we don't think you'll win, but this can get the foot in the door for this. And they asked me if I was ready to become the cornerstone for that. And I said, yes, where do I sign? I couldn't imagine graduating without doing this. So 2 weeks before I graduated, my lawsuit went public and it was officially filed with the Office of Civil Rights. And I graduated, thank God. And I spent the whole summer making publicity for my case. And one day I got a call from the White House. They invited me to speak at a conference in Miami with the president. I did. And 3 days later, he signed an executive order to include Judaism under Title VI protections. So it was a whirlwind of a time. All this happened in about a year. And then a year after that, NYU settled my lawsuit. The only thing I asked for in the suit was policy change to define anti-Semitism and to include it in existing discrimination policies at NYU.
Wow. Sometimes we spend decades trying to make changes. That's pretty impressive that that could happen in that short a span of time.
Yeah. To be fair, this executive order had been in the works for a while. They just kind of needed something to pin it to. You just need something to attach it to. And my lawsuit came at an opportune time. And I think that everyone has a path in life. And I got very lucky that God just put mine in front of me. And it was just a decision of whether or not I take it. And I'm really grateful I did.
Mariam, I'm wondering, what are contemporary issues that all of these categories, the Egyptian, Coptic, Christian, are dealing with? What do you see your generation dealing with, and how do you see them coming out?
That's a really great question. There's a couple different ways I can answer that. Obviously, there's internal problems within Egypt, and it's not just problems that face the Copts, but it's problems that face everybody. But there are embedded ways that your neighbor gets a chance to persecute you. It's a different thing to have a state persecuting you. There's legal ways around that. You can change a system. You could change a bureaucracy, however hard it may be. But if your neighbor is the one that has, misconceptions about you as a faith group and thinks that you're an infidel and thinks you're a second-class citizen and thinks you're less Egyptian because you're a Christian and not a Muslim, that's a very long road journey to change that. If I'm talking about the diaspora, and like I said earlier, it's a very young diaspora. We're maybe 70 years. Whereas the Jewish diaspora is as long as as old as the Jewish people. Yeah, exactly. So with a new Coptic diaspora, I think we're still trying to learn how to organize ourselves and how to advocate for our family members, both in the church and, genetic family members back home. That's a new space we're trying to field and navigate. And I think it's going to take us a couple more decades to figure out.
Are you finding that some people are having a bit of knowledge that you exist as a group, Coptic Christians?
It depends on the circles. Obviously, a lot more since we started doing Americanish and doing this work, which is really awesome. I don't know why I didn't think that would be an outcome of the show, because I don't walk around like I'm Coptic today. Like, it's just who I am. But I guess people who hear those words for the first time, it's a new thing. So that's really wonderful. I would love for everybody to know about my community and others like it.
Adela, as a Syrian Jew, do you find that distinguishes you from other Jewish traditions or groups?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually very funny because, again, I grew up in Mexico and I have cousins in Brazil and in Monaco and in London, and my family's all over the place. So I always traveled a lot to visit them. So I thought I was very worldly. And turns out I really only knew one kind of Jew. And then when I spoke to my mom, I realized, wow, Jews from Syria are in the minority. And I didn't know that. And then I found out Jews are a minority in general. And I also did not know that because I grew up in a very small community, right? A small, close-knit community. So I didn't really know what else was out there. I went to a Syrian Jewish school. All of my friends were Syrian Jews. And I just didn't know that there were European Jews. And then suddenly you show up to college and, the European Jews are the majority of Jews. And then there's Sephardic, which is just Middle Eastern Jews, are a minority. And then within that minority, you have Syrian Jews. So end of the day, when it comes to Judaism, we all have the same base, but similar to Christianity, we all kind of take it in our own direction. So our day-to-day traditions vary a little bit. The way that we pray varies a little bit. But one of the things that Mariam and I talk about a lot on the show is her being an Egyptian Christian and I am a Syrian Jew. So we both have that Middle Eastern link. So the way our families are, the way that we structure our families, that has a lot to do with where our communities were based that are not necessarily faith-based. So it's interesting because I could find a lot of commonality with Mariam, and sometimes I could find very little commonality with a European Jew who grew up in a completely different way from me.
I love the Middle Eastern connection that you made there. I guess if I wanted to start a fight, I could ask which country invented hummus?
No, don't do this to us. We've been so good.
We're not going to. We're not going to go there. You can have that as a future episode and take off the gloves, and we'll see.
Behind the scenes debate.
Yeah.
This is In Good Faith. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Good Faith.
I'm wondering, Mariam, you tell this wonderful story in one of your podcast episodes of Americanish, where you're talking about being in Egypt and living among Muslim families, and that your family would often observe Ramadan because it just worked better to do that with the neighbors and back and forth. You have this story about a plate that I would love you to tell. Do you remember this?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. It's hard to forget. So we were one of the only Coptic families in my father's village. So it meant that our interactions daily were with a lot of non-Christians, with Muslims, in fact. So around Ramadan time, it was just more comfortable to observe Ramadan. It doesn't mean we, observed it to a T, but if you're a Copt walking around in the street and you know all of these people that you grew up with that have lived long their whole lives by your side, can't drink water and can't have food in 104-degree weather, you just might not take a sip of water right then and there and wait till you get inside a house or something. But we had this plate, and I don't remember whose plate it was, but for Ramadan, it's very traditional. And for even Coptic holidays, it's very traditional to make a lot of food, as Middle Easterners do, and then send a plate of the food over to the neighbor's house. So for Ramadan, the plate would just be constantly back and forth, and we completely forgot who started this tradition. But whatever you were making that day, you always knew to make a little bit extra because you're sending some over next door. And my mom still does it to this day in New York with her neighbors. There's a plate and it goes around.
I think that's just a beautiful tradition, and also a nice would-be metaphor for how we could understand each other better. What have you gotten back from your audience as a podcast, or what are you hoping that they're getting?
What have we gotten back? We've gotten back a lot of feedback, which is always so nice. This is very experimental. A Copt from Egypt and a Syrian Jew have never interacted in this way on a public level ever, to my knowledge. So I think we're getting a lot of feedback on how to best communicate ourselves or cultures with each other. And I think that's been really helpful because obviously we're friends, but this is a public platform that people listen to. What we hope to get back, or what I hope to get back, is more interaction between our communities. They're not communities that naturally gravitate towards each other for so many reasons. But through our interactions, you see very quickly and obviously that they have a lot in common, and there's a lot to share there. Adela?
Yeah, I'd say my favorite thing that we've gotten back are messages from people in communities I had never heard of, like people who are like, I'm a, Tunisian XYZ, or I'm a, this too, or that kind of Christian. And everyone's just messaging us and commenting on our videos, all of their Americanish identities. Or we had an episode where we talk about all of these different things that we are and how hard it is to explain to people when they say, "Where are you from?" And we just kind of sit there and say, well, where am I from? And we have this existential crisis. And it's so interesting to see how many people from completely different backgrounds are saying, oh, my mom's Russian and I was born in Puerto Rico and now I live in Miami. And it's like, oh, well, there we go. Another Americanish person, another Americanish story.
Mariam Wahba and Adela Cojab are podcast hosts of the podcast Americanish. What a delight to hear from them. First of all, they talk faster than I can think. And so I am kept on my toes by these two, which I really like. And my favorite moment was just towards the end there, where we hear the story that Mariam shares about being one of maybe the only Christian in their neighborhood, and everyone else is celebrating Ramadan. And so how they sort of help out, and they'll send over food. And then that plate, they don't even remember which family it first came from. That plate gets passed back and forth and back and forth. It's just a tradition. And boy, if that could be a little metaphor for how we can literally feed each other, but also just find ways of knowing about and respecting each other's traditions without feeling threatened ourselves.
Yeah, wonderfully illustrated, that chance to participate in someone else's faith without appropriating their faith.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think for a lot of us, when we see especially Jewishness or Jewish identity, I think a lot of people feel familiar with that. They've seen that in the movies. They've heard the history. Maybe they've studied. Maybe as Christians they've studied the Bible, and they sort of feel like, oh, I know a lot. But one of the things, Steve, that you pointed out was, I thought I knew something about this, but just listening to your podcast, right? I learned so much in 30 seconds. And there's just such a benefit of hearing from people talking about their own experience, and even the really difficult ones. So, for instance, Adela talks about visiting the Holocaust camps in Europe and what that experience was like for her. And I think that's important for us to hear.
Israel actually has an established program of sending high school students to Poland to visit the Holocaust sites. And they get to hear, at least for a few more years until they're all gone, from actual survivors to be able to share that. In the interest of just knowing what it's like to be human and how we can learn to get along, we have to learn from our mistakes. My dear friend, Asker Ashkenazi, is from Jerusalem. He was born there. He lives just outside there. He's going to tell us about sending his own children on one of these trips, and he goes along on one of them, and why he thinks it's so important. Asker has been a licensed Israeli guide for over 35 years, graduated from Hebrew University of Jerusalem with degrees in history and international relations. He taught history at Hebrew University and participated in archaeological digs at various sites in Israel, among them Beit Shan, the huge Roman excavation. He knows his history.
They started about 40 years ago. 1983 were the very first of those Holocaust educational missions went to Poland. And the goal is, I would say, first of all, to learn about the Holocaust, to learn about the systematic mass murders, mass extermination of 6 million Jews. I would say the main goals are to strengthen the Jewish identity, to strengthen their connection to their past, to the Jewish history, to Jewish heritage, solidarity with the Jewish people, and to preserve the memory of the Holocaust, which is very important. Also, of course, the importance of democracy, to protect democracy, to fight against racism. And when those kids come back to Israel, they come back usually with a stronger sense of belonging, both to the Jews and also to their land in Israel.
So describe these trips to me. Who goes and what are they doing?
It's for a week, sponsored by the Ministry of Education. The participants are high school students, usually between 16 and 18 years old, 11th and 12th grade. Usually it's their teachers who escort them. Besides their teachers, there will also be guides, actually authorized by both the Ministry of Education and Yad Vashem. Yad Vashem is Israel's World Holocaust Memorial Center, and also Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors will also escort those groups for a whole week. They will explain on the site during the trip. And it's very important, that they hear those stories actually firsthand from the Holocaust survivors. And usually those trips are around Warsaw, Krakow, Lublin. They visit extermination camps. They also try to learn about the rich Jewish cultural and spiritual life in Poland back, before the Holocaust, like visiting synagogues, cemeteries, Jewish quarters, etc.
And how impressive to be able to take a tour and be met by a survivor. There aren't many of those left.
Israel went through what is called Holocaust repression. The survivors, for a pretty long time, they did not want to talk. They don't want to share their testimony. They don't want to talk about what they went through, about this immense tragedy and the depths of the horror. And there being, besides that, also, a lot of dehumanization. They're deprived of their human dignity. They did not want to talk about it. And the second generation, their children, most of them also refused to listen to their parents, And that actually continued, I would say, for the last 30, 35 years after Israel was established. We realized that the Holocaust survivors would be talking, their numbers are decreasing. And it's so important, to hear from them firsthand about those atrocities and what happens.
You're a professional tour guide. Have you guided these tours to Poland too?
Yes. What I did a few times was taking groups to Poland. I did that actually during the week of the Holocaust Memorial Day. And, during this week of the Holocaust Memorial Day, actually there is a March of the Living in Poland. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No.
Well, the March of the Living, in contrast with the death marches in Poland, during the end of the Second World War, before the war came to an end, as the Nazis were withdrawing from the death camps, they actually forced the inmates to march towards the west for hundreds of miles. And many of those inmates who were already exhausted and sick from oppressive work and the terrible conditions, many of them actually died on the way. And those who stayed behind or lagged behind were shot. So today we have this symbolic March of the Living from Auschwitz to Birkenau, symbolic march. Actually, we say loudly that we, even though we lost 1/3 of our people, here we are, we survived, we came back to our land, we're rebuilding ourselves on the ashes of the Holocaust. And I escorted those March of the Living in Poland, and then those groups usually came to Israel to continue their trip in Israel.
I think it's wonderful that these high school age kids, 16 and up, get this experience. They need to get that at that age. Are they old enough to fully understand it? Will they understand better later?
I think they are. 11th and 12th grade, they will go through educational, emotional, behavioral preparation before they go there. I would say Holocaust became a part of the Jewish identity. It actually was filtered down in the Jewish consciousness. So I think they're old enough. Look, the Israeli youth, young generation, who grows up and lives in their own independent state freely, they have no idea about anti-Semitism. They have a hard time understanding this hatred or the prejudices by many people against the Jews. So by going there and visiting those sites where those atrocities took place, when they come back, they come back, first of all, with a stronger sense of belonging to the Jewish people, belonging to their land, Israel.
You have two daughters and then your youngest son. First, I want to ask about your daughter's experience because they went with school groups. What did they talk about when they came home? What did they remember from that? What impressed them?
My daughters, when they came back, for example, actually they told me that by being there, they actually realized how important Israel was. Actually, they perceived Israel as a guarantee against the second Holocaust. When my younger daughter was in Poland, and she called me one day, she said they were waiting in line to enter a museum. And there was a man who came up and who approached them and asked them, "Where are you from?" And my younger daughter, Ella, said, "We're from Israel." And he says, "You mean you're Jews? You're Jewish?" And naturally, my younger daughter, "Yeah, of course we're Jewish." He says, "Most of Israel, are Jews." And then he said a few words in Polish, which did not sound very nice, and my daughter called me. I said, "Dad, why did this man didn't like us? Why did he sound like he was cursing us?" And I told him, "That's exactly why we sent you, to understand what the Jewish people."
Your son, you ended up going with him. What was that like to be there with one of your children and go through those places?
It was very important to take my son there. I think that's something everybody should be doing. We should always try to remember the dark, the evil capabilities of the human beings, and educate the future generations, hoping and believing that if they learn about it, they know about it, they will remember. And we hope that we shall remember, we shall never forget, and to make sure that something similar never happens again.
So historically, Jews were allowed to leave Germany or Poland, but they had no place to go. Is that right?
We say if Israel existed before the Holocaust, we could prevent this from taking place, from those atrocities from taking place. Because if you remember, till January 1941, theoretically, the Jews were allowed to leave the Nazi-controlled Germany. The problem was not so much leaving, the problem was where to go, because nobody wanted to accept them. There were desperate refugees trying to find a place, to go, and nobody wanted to accept it. And also Israel is perceived also as a safe haven, as a home for the Jewish people. So when they come back, they realize how important it is for the Jewish people to have a home which is ready to accept any Jew from anywhere. Actually, it's our law of return. Israel's basic law is law of return. Any Jew who decides to come back home, they can do it. They can do it, and they will actually become a part of Israel.
This is In Good Faith. We'll be right back. Welcome back to In Good Faith.
There are people that I have met who, after World War II, said to themselves, there cannot be a God because no God would allow what has happened to my family or anyone's family. There are other people who came through that experience, and it seems like they held on to their faith or committed to their faith. I don't know what makes the difference. Do you have any commentary about that? Because I can't blame people who trusted more in God, and I certainly can't blame people who saw what happened and feel like they don't know if they could trust or believe in a God.
I would say one of the reasons that the Jewish people actually, many of them decide not to escape or to run away or to fight back, was because of their strong faith in God. Mm-hmm. They could not believe. They didn't want to believe that those atrocities, those terrible, immense tragedies God would not let those events to take place. They were believers. Let me remind you, many of those Jews who perished in the Holocaust were religious Jews, Orthodox Jews. And in many cases, their rabbis actually did not encourage them to leave in many countries, in many cities. So they stayed there, strongly believing that something Something like that could never happen. Every time things got worse and worse and worse, they said they cannot get worse anymore. They cannot get worse than that. Each time there was a reaction.
Yes.
And I know some Holocaust survivors who actually lost their faith. But some actually, continued.
I'm curious if this idea of never again and the Holocaust, is that just as strong whether as a Jew you are Orthodox and practicing or Reform or conservative or completely secular? Do they all share that awareness of the necessity for education?
I would say the overwhelming, almost every Israeli shares the same. As I said, nowadays we realize how important it is to teach, to educate the new generation, and to encourage the Holocaust survivors to speak out, to tell their testimonies. For example, you visited the Yad Vashem, Israel's World Holocaust Remembrance Center, which has a historical museum, as you know. And the historical museum was renovated maybe about 25 years ago. And the reason behind it was the former historical museum went in a chronological order, explaining, teaching about the Holocaust, different chapters in the history of the Holocaust. But something very important was missing. The survivors were missing. You would not hear, you would not see, you would not hear the survivors speak out, tell their testimonies, tell firsthand those atrocities, what they went through. We realized that was a big mistake. Then we decided to renovate, to reorganize the historical museum. And today, if you remember, when you visit the historical museum, a lot of emphasis is put on the survivors. You always hear them speak out, talk about themselves, what they went through, which is something, their numbers are decreasing. And as you said, even today, relatively such a short time, after this happens, many people are denying it. So it's, again, Israel is really today encouraging, the survivors to speak out and to tell their testimonies.
Being able to see those faces and see these people who have lived now and they're in their, at the time of it, they were videotaped, they were in their 70s, their 80s, sometimes older, sharing their stories and their remembrances. But there's something triumphant about knowing that they did live, that they have descendants too, most of them. I think that's really beautiful. What could we do here in the U.S. or in any country to be sure something like the Holocaust doesn't happen again, whether it's anti-Semitism or to any other group?
I strongly believe that it's very important to remind the people and to teach and to remind the people about the, as I said, the dark and the evil capabilities and capacities of the human beings, what they're able to do. And to future generations, to educate with the future generations. I think it's very important to educate the generations. And one of the best ways to educate the Israeli youth is actually through those trips to Poland. It's a very deep experience, very hard, very sad and shocking. But I think it's very important for them we say never again. And when we say that, we mean it. We'll do all. We shall do all we can to make sure something similar doesn't take place again.
That's Asker Ashkenazi talking about the Holocaust education program in Israel, where he sent his children, as high school students do there, to Poland to experience and hear the stories of those who survived those concentration camps. One thing that really struck me was how he said they could leave until 1941 from the European countries, but people were not willing to accept them. Yeah. And that kind of blows my mind, but then we think about immigration debates in all around the world, even today.
At one point, he really stressed that we don't want to forget about the past. That's part of the program, to introduce the students to that so they don't forget about what happened so it doesn't happen again. And then the thing of it is, in Poland, they were in a safe space, but there was a tolerance for anti-Semitism, and that tolerance turned to persecution. It was very interesting because Adela had mentioned that there was a tolerance for anti-Semitism at NYU towards some of the Jewish students. And she stepped in and had them change the policy so that tolerance for anti-Semitism didn't turn into persecution again.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying here, Tanya. And for me, listening to Asker talk about the darkness that humans can commit, we need to be aware of it. We need to be cognizant of it. I think that's really important. But I have to say, listening to Mariam and Adela, I just was filled with all this hope because of their enthusiasm and because of their energy and the way they're sort of tackling these issues, not only by fighting back when they need to fight back, but sort of proactively introducing the world to who they are, what their concerns are, and how they are, part of, as I said before, the American story.
And there's just so much to learn if we will just listen to people with curiosity instead of to prove I'm right or whatever it might be. We asked the question that anyone would ask in this show: how do we stop this from happening in the future? And of course, education is part of it. But then we just move on and we haven't really solved the problem. We're just asking the question that we all ask. And the sad truth is, as much as we say never again, it's already happened in Serbia, in Bosnia, in Rwanda, and places around the world. And as people of faith, every faith has a directive to honor the divinity within our fellow human beings. So all of us, men and women of faith, have this obligation to try and help people, to heal people, to respect people as equal with us. And yet, as human beings, over and over, when the refugees from these experiences start showing up, just like in World War II, we don't want them, is what we often hear. That's cause for reflection for all of us as people of faith. Thanks to Mariam, thanks to Adela, and thank you to Asker, all of them, for sharing their personal experience, kind of what they've learned and why what they do is important to them. That's proved to be important for other people, too.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
This episode was produced by Heather Bigley. Our production team includes Leah King, Tanya Lockett, and Katarina Martinic. Our sound designers were Daniel Phillips and Dallin Jepson. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. In fact, we think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. If you like the show, we hope you leave a comment or review where you get your podcast. Or better yet, share an episode with a friend. Find us on Twitter at InGoodFaithPod, on Instagram and Facebook at InGoodFaithPodcast. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you'll join me again soon, right here in Good Faith.